Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AVPN March webinar on modern slavery and the role of corporates. My name is Chen, and I'm the Greater China consultant at the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network. AVPN is a unique founders network committed to building a high-impact philanthropy and a social investment community across Asia. Currently, we have over 400 members across 29 countries, and we're very pleased to have two of our members based in India and Hong Kong speaking today. Representing C&A Foundation, we have Anandit Roy Chaudhary. Today, we will call him by Roy. Roy is the program manager overseeing gender justice and human rights issues. He will share with us C&A Foundation's work around eradicating forced labor while strengthening communities. Following that, we have Susan Clare, Regional Head of Macquarie Group Foundation Asia. Susan will highlight Macquarie Group Foundation's projects working to raise awareness on modern slavery and support long-term change. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping instructions. We will not take any questions during the presentations, but we will open up the floor for Q&A afterwards. Please feel free to use the console to type in your questions during the webinar, and I will raise the questions to our speakers. If you have further questions that are not answered by the end of the webinar, you can email us at membership@avpn.asia. Without further ado, I will now hand over the presentation to Roy.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Really grateful. This is a wonderful opportunity that AVPN has given us, and I think we hopefully will have the ability to add some value in the conversation that we're going to have together. I don't completely want it to be a one-sided conversation, despite the fact that I'm currently looking at a computer screen and speaking, which is a little strange. But nevertheless, I would actually want to keep my presentation short so that we can have more time for the question and answer session at the very end. I'll hope that I can respond to some of the questions that you have. To start with, I have a basic question for all of you, and this is more for you to introspect. I know that you would not probably be able to respond to me because it's only me who gets to speak at this point. The question that I'd ask is, would you all know at this point in time what brand of clothing that you're wearing? Now, even if you don't remember, I know there is a way that you could probably look into your shirt or top or whatever you're wearing and look at the label, and you can see the brand of clothing that you're wearing. Now, if I ask the question saying, do you know where this clothing or where this piece of clothing has been made from, you would probably also know it because in some small tag in your garment piece, it says made in India, made in Turkey, made in China, made in Sri Lanka, or somewhere else in Brazil, in Mexico, etc. Now, if I asked you the last question, where I would say, can you guarantee that the clothing that you're wearing now is not made by forced and child labor? Almost all of you would wonder as to what this question is all about, simply because you don't know. You don't know if there is any mechanism in place which guarantees whether the clothing that you're currently wearing is actually forced and child labor free. That is where the work of C&A Foundation comes in, where we want to eradicate forced and child labor from the apparel industry. May I go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, first of all, it's important to understand the context of the problem that we really have. And it is important to understand that at least 21 million people are being exploited in various forms of forced labor, including bonded labor, trafficking, and other forms of modern slavery. At some level, it is a thing of the past. It is a thing of the Black Ages. We call it a part of the nasty part of our history that we don't want to remember. But the truth is that in current day, we have more numbers in terms of modern day slaves that are in various forms that exist that have never been there in history. So 21 million people at least are in modern day slavery. 1 in 4 of them are children, which means they're 18 years, they're below the age of 18. And from the total people exploited, over half of them are women and girls. So there's a very strong gender context to the scenario. Can you go to the next slide, please? ILO has defined in its convention number 29 what forced labor is all about. But it is very important to understand that 9 out of 10 cases of forced labor are privately imposed, which means that they are beyond the realm of immediate government control. They are happening in supply chains that are run by corporations, that are run by smaller businesses, that are run by farmers, that are run by farming organizations, etc. So this is beyond the realm that the government controls directly. Next slide, please. People, the ILO sources are saying that 168 million children are currently engaged in child labor. If I just talk about India, which is the country that I'm currently situated in, I'm speaking from Delhi. Just in India, we know that there probably is as many as 50% of the child labor in India are actually in the agricultural sector, and about 20% of the child labor are probably in various forms of the supply chain. So here we're looking at supply chains in terms of clothing, in terms of electronics, things that we use on a regular basis without realizing that this may have been produced in India and may have been produced by children who do not get access to school, do not get access to healthcare, do not have access or freedom of movement, and are producing for us at pittance salaries and in various kinds of exploitative circumstances. Next, please. Now, it is also important to understand that the moment we say the supply chain of the apparel sector, people kind of only think of the brands and probably the cotton shoe factories where their cloths are being produced. What they tend to forget is to understand the entire realm of where their clothing is being produced in. The first one, which may surprise some of you, is the farms where the cotton is being grown. So a lot of, about 60% of the overall clothing in the world is cotton. And then that cotton is grown in various parts of the world, India being a large producer of cotton. And please remember, it is very difficult at this stage to identify if any of the cotton produced in India is actually child labor free, simply because the mechanisms that ensure or guarantee lack of child labor or lack of forced labor is not in place in the country. Then, of course, there are the various traders who actually then bring in the cotton into the ginners. The ginners are the ones who actually produce the cotton into threads, which then go to the spinning mills. The spinning mills actually create what is called the textiles, which can be, the textile may be produced here in India, but then the textiles may be imported into countries like, let's say, Myanmar, it could be China, it could be Korea, etc., where finally in the cotton shoe factories they are being done. What we also tend to forget is not every bit of the work in the cotton shoe factory happens in the cotton shoe factory. A lot of the work, especially in terms of embroidery, in terms of dyeing, or coloring, in terms of finishing of denims, in terms of giving it torn appearances, etc. All of that happens in small workshops that are not directly under the realm of the compliance mechanism that brands and retailers have. And of course, a lot of the work also happens at the home level, where clothing goes into the homes of individuals, where value addition to the clothing that happens. It could be buttoning, it could be embroidery work, etc. And then it comes into the supply chain through the brands and retailers. Now, why am I mentioning this is that if you look at the brands and retailers and the tier 1 factories, which is the cut and sew factories, these are the ones that very clearly have a very strong compliance mechanism in place where they can ensure that there is no forced and child labor. However, what we need to understand that the garments that we are wearing do not only be produced in these 2 areas. They are produced in all of the others that I'm talking about that you can see on your screen. And you must remember that all of this have huge probabilities of forced and child labor in them. Next, please. So, there are some key drivers for forced and child labor in the apparel sector. The 3 major ones, really. One is the weak rule of law in producing countries. When I say producing countries, I mean countries where it is actually being made, not necessarily where it is being sold. So that's a big piece of the problem, where in many countries where people would say, these were poor, impoverished groups of people who are not getting food to eat. Now, because the work that they have, they're getting food to eat. So even if their rights are violated to a certain degree, what is the problem? At least they're getting food to eat. At least they have economic stability of a certain kind, which they did not have. The second element, of course, is the opacity of the supply chain in itself, the lack of transparency. At this point, like I was saying earlier, the compliance mechanisms can only go up to a certain level and it does not go beyond it. So you don't really know what is happening in the field, what is happening in the dyeing house, what is happening in these factories that are beyond the compliance realm, and therefore you have no control over it. The third, of course, is the deep social and economic inequalities, including gender discrimination. If you know, and I'm sure you do, that about 75% of the overall apparel sector is actually run by women. So in terms of your sewers, the cutters, the finishers, or the dyers, they're mostly women. But the decision makers, in terms of the ones who actually run the factories, manage the factories, supervise the shop floor, they're almost always men. So there is this tremendous inequality and dire difference in terms of how men and women function within the supply chain. Needless to say, we work together with key stakeholders, including non-governmental organizations, universities at times, trade unions, etc., in the sector to address these above challenges. Next, please. So if you look at the overall ecosystem of who are the different agencies, if you see the apparel sector in the middle, all of these others have a very important role to play, whether it is the media, whether it is the research organizations, whether it is the government through policy, whether it is the technology companies, whether it is the NGOs and the social enterprises. Each one have a very, very important role to play. We are primarily a funder or a donor organization who try and support with funding and some amount of technical support to all of these others in being able to have a clear impact on the apparel supply chain. What is also very important to notice here is that the media and then the consumers have a very, very important role to play. Now, this is another question, and I know you will not be able to answer to me directly, but again, for introspection, when you go out to buy a piece of cloth, it could be for a special occasion, it could be a regular basic need, etc. But when you buy it, what is the question do you ask? What is the price? What is the design? Do I like it? Does it fit me? Do I look good in it? These are some of the questions that we are asking. What we almost never ask is that, is this piece of clothing created by forced or child labor? That's a question that as customers or consumers, we are probably not asking. Next, please. So our strategy is kind of three-pronged. We're looking at the issue of creating greater transparency, creating greater access to justice, and also building the field. I will, in my next slides, talk about a few, a little bit details about the strategy itself, and more importantly, also talk about some of the programs that we are supporting on the ground. And sometimes what we also do is kind of bring all of these three strategies, the three legs of my stool, as I call it. I will try and say sometimes what we do is we bring all of those three together in being able to build the program. Next, please. So improve supply chain transparency, particularly for accountability. Next, please. Now, as I had said earlier, if you look at this map, you would see that the brand has a very strong link with the tier 1 companies, and these are the cut and sew factories where they do very clear and guided compliance mechanisms. So these are absolutely clear. There are no problems involved, etc. And even if they are there, the compliance mechanism would probably be able to find it. Of course, there is some amount of compliance that also kind of goes up to the sourcing agents or to the subcontractors. What is completely beyond the bounds, and which is a very important part of the industry, is the mills where the textile is being made. As I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, that the clothing may be structured together into a garment, into a shirt that I'm currently wearing. Maybe that is being done in Myanmar, but the textile may be coming from somewhere else, in a mill, let's say in India or somewhere else. So it is very important to notice that the mills have a very important role to play, and there is no compliance, no transparency of what's happening in the mills. Of course, the second piece is the fact about the laundries. The laundries are the ones that are actually doing the finishing, the finishing of the products, the dry cleaning before it actually goes into the shop windows. So there is no compliance mechanism in that. The spinners who are actually creating the threads, the ginners who are actually bringing in the cotton into a form, and of course the raw material producer, and needless to say the unauthorized workers. None of them have a very clear transparency mechanism in place. So what I'm saying is that your clothing may be created in all of these places, but what you are getting to see in terms of ensuring transparency is only those 4 elements that we have currently. Next, please. Now, this is probably a little complicated diagram to really present without being in person, but nevertheless, I'm sure that AVPN can make my presentation available to everyone, and I'll be more than happy for you to have it. Is the fact that what we have been able to do is clearly identify what are the challenges within transparency, what could be our scope of work in terms of the transparency mechanisms in place, and finally, who could be the individuals who can catalyze change, and therefore work towards that. Next, please. And the systems change piece that happens because of this is, of course, catalyzed change not just in individuals but in groups and systems. So shifting of social norms, shifting of standards and process innovations, changes of policies and public disclosure. So, for instance, at this point in time, just to give an example, almost let's even say governments are huge procurers of clothing. So, for instance, all school uniforms in India that have been created, that have been made and then procured by the government for the police, for the army, for the government hospitals, or even for the school uniforms that are being made for children in government schools. This is a humongous. I mean, India being with 1.3 billion people, you can imagine how huge this market is, and a lot of it is these are government outfits. So the government is actually a huge procurer themselves. But the government, unfortunately, does not have any strong mechanism in place currently in India that clearly talks about no forced and child labor in the supply chain from which they are buying the garments. So the government, in some ways, are buying or procuring products and are completely unaware because the transparency mechanism does not exist. The other thing, of course, is what could be some of the expected outcomes that we are looking at. Most importantly, improve brand and supplier practices to deter forced and child labor. Unless that happens, unless the people who are in business who take ownership, and that's where the corporate piece comes in, the corporate responsibility of being able to take ownership of how to change business and change the systems to promote positive practices come into play, things will not change. And of course, all of this will have a positive impact in transparency in the overall value chain. Next, please. Next, please. So what I'm giving you is a short description of one of the projects that we support. And one of the things that we talk about is the global trade on humans is greater today than any other time in history. And as we were saying, there are a huge number of people who are forced into child labor, into forced labor, and we don't even know the quantum and how it's working out and what are the different sectors it's in. What had happened in India and in the South Asian region is that the discourse on human trafficking had slowly and steadily died down. And as you know, a lot of it is kind of also linked to the fact that there is lack of funding to actually do work on transparency. So one of our funding is to fight forced labor and human trafficking through journalism and media development. And our partner, of course, is the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Needless to say, they're an amazing partner. And what they are now doing is working through their web journals stories on human trafficking, which they are then kind of sharing across. And it is also very interesting because it also targets the local languages of Tamil and Hindi, which covers a large proportion of the country. The next example that I'll give is the Goodwill example. Next, please. Here we are working, the one before, please. Yeah, here. Next, please. Yeah, here we are working with an organization called Goodwill, which are working with brands and with suppliers to reduce forced labor in the supply chain, in the informal supply chain. And it's very important to realize that in the informal supply chain, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the embroidery work, bead work that we have in our clothing is done at the home-based worker level. And that's where there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of changing, improving supply chain transparency to address issues of forced labor. And this becomes very difficult simply because this is happening within someone's home. It is not a factory. It's happening in someone's home in a village. And therefore, to monitor that requires a lot of very interesting interventions that we are bringing. Next, please. So I'll talk a little bit about improving policies and their enforcement that will ensure access to justice. Next. So again, in this one, what is important to understand is that we are looking at a situation where law enforcement is extremely weak. And like I was saying, a lot of people don't even consider forced labor unless it is a violent form of forced labor. When there's physical violence, sexual violence, people don't even consider forced labor as a big problem because, like I was saying, a lot of people would say, at least they're getting food to eat. So therefore, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of advocacy intervention in arguing a position as to why it is important, and arguing on behalf of the victims and survivors. And then, of course, look at shifting norms and public mindset, and more importantly, increase the demand from consumers, change of behaviors. In this the work that we do, one big piece of work is survivors are actually rehabilitated to attain viable and force-free livelihoods. So we are saying that these are the same people who can go through a process of intervention where they can now earn a dignified livelihood without being forced into labor. And of course, the positive impact being stronger laws, adequate levels of capacity of partners to actually deliver the program. Next, please. Next. Next. So the program I'll talk about is the example is that of Freedom Fund. As you probably would know, there are a large number of girls and young women workers who remain in situation of bondage and child labor in the textile mills of Tamil Nadu. In many ways, a lot of people say that Tamil Nadu probably is where the most of the world's textiles are being created. They may be structured or cut and sewed and finished somewhere else, but Tamil Nadu is where it's all starts. So therefore, the objective for us to improve the policy environment to ensure that these practices stop, factories have better practices in place, and actually survivors don't have to go into this work, and they can have better opportunities, and to support holistic programming, including education, women's empowerment in these hotspot. Hello, can you please move the slide?
Can you hear me now, Roy?
I can hear you, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I think the connection had some issue. Is the correct slide?
Okay. Can we go to the next one, please?
Sure. I guess the slide has some issue. Let me restart it. Sorry. Is it okay now?
Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, so yeah, I think we got cut off. So it's all right. I just wanted to just say, essentially what we need to understand is that we are in a situation where we are in a situation where the business of apparel is going to grow. It's not going to come to a halt. People now have more and more and more clothes than they ever did before, and this is a reality. Now, what we need to therefore focus on is that how do we the responsibility is not just to make the industry business friendly, but also to look at the opportunity of making business more responsible. So therefore, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of the advocacy piece that we definitely support. The other piece, of course, is that of the corporates. And I'm not merely talking about organizations that are, the large C&A and H&M and M&S, the large pieces of corporations who automatically are extremely sensitive and probably are bringing in a lot of compliance mechanism in their work process. But what is important to bring in is the element of transparency to the last mile, to understand the fact that the business entity is far beyond for corporations to go down to the last mile, bringing the elements of the elements of responsible sourcing, the elements of responsible producing, and most importantly, the element of responsible selling of the products. And finally, of course, it is a very strong role that the consumers have. Till the point consumers are only focused on the look and feel of the clothing and how expensive or inexpensive the clothing is, until we start asking these questions about human rights, about value of the value that the supply chain is bringing in terms of forced and child labor, whether it is being in any way a perpetrator or not. These are questions that the consumer needs to ask, because without that, we are going far away in terms of producing more and more garments without realizing the consequences, the human rights violation consequences that we are bringing in, and thereby the problems that it creates for the society. That's where I'll stop. I'm very happy to take any questions at any point in time. Thank you.
All right, so our next speaker is Susan.
Thanks, Roy. It's a pleasure to share the virtual floor with you, and great to hear about the work that C&A Foundation are doing in the sector as well. I'd also like to echo my thanks to AVPN for the opportunity to share the experiences of Macquarie today, but also to reiterate that we are continuing to learn as we go. And I'm really looking forward to your questions later on, to your suggestions, and hopefully the collaboration and involvement of many of you around the region in this issue. Today, I'm going to share the journey that we've gone through with Macquarie Group to engage and to fund around the broader issue of modern slavery. But first, let me give a brief introduction to Macquarie. We're a diversified financial group with presence around the world. We've got more than 14,000 staff operating in offices in 28 countries, and we're headquartered over in Sydney in Australia. Closer to home, here in Asia, we have got 13 offices across 11 markets and around 3,500 staff. And pleasingly for me, with my role, more and more of these staff are getting involved in the communities in which they live and work. With regard to the Macquarie Group Foundation, it's been part of Macquarie since the very beginning. It's a staff-led, grassroots model, and that really reflects the wider ethos of Macquarie. At Macquarie, we employ talented and passionate people who've got great ideas, and the foundation empowers them to use these same skills in supporting their communities. The foundation team works alongside our staff. We provide support to their fundraising efforts, to their volunteering opportunities, and supporting their pro bono efforts. I've listed here some of our high-level achievements on this slide, but of course feel free to visit our website to find out more about the wider projects that we're working in. In addition to those areas, we've got a global strategic grants portfolio. Traditionally, we have managed dozens of grants around the world, and these support a really interesting and diverse range of projects that are innovative and that are really addressing a need. In the past, they've supported a range of sectors, be it arts and culture, to medical research or youth education. In 2014, here in Asia, we saw an opportunity to be a little bit more focused in the way in which we address social issues over a longer term, and also an opportunity to give us a way to bring our disparate region together. As I highlighted, we do have 13 different offices across from pretty different markets, and this was an issue that was going to be relevant to everybody. So we quickly recognised when we started looking at this at the region that modern slavery was a key issue. But where were we going to start? So let me tell you a little bit about our journey as we went through this. As I mentioned, we started looking at the global sector, and we realised quite quickly that there's a lot of uncertainty and inconsistency and competing information. The statistics remain unclear, and I've listed on the slide there that there's somewhere between 21 and 40 million people. Late last year, a more cohesive number came out, which was fantastic, but I've left it on there because I think it's important to remember that there is still such inconsistency and uncertainty around this, and the numbers are really unknown. In terms of profits, it's a significant industry, $150 billion. That is a huge amount of money that is flowing through financial organisations and institutions around the world around this. It's also affecting many, many different industries, be it construction, fisheries, and domestic workers. We focused on domestic workers because of the effect and the impact it had here in Asia. As I've listed there, we've got a large percentage of the world's estimated domestic workers here in the Asia Pacific. We also wanted to look at the issue holistically, as I mentioned earlier. So we wanted to look at it from the point of view of prevention, from intervention, and from rehabilitation. And we also looked at this bearing in mind the financial and human resources we had access to and how best we could use these for long-term and greater impact. To start off with, we conducted a large number of stakeholder interviews. We looked at existing staff engagement activity across the region to bring in and keep and maintain the staff-led grassroots model. And we also looked at those sectors where we might actually affect some change, both internally with the people that we're working with and externally through our networks. As I prefaced earlier, we focused a majority of our efforts around issues facing migrant domestic workers with regards to their vulnerability to trafficking and slavery. The issues that were affecting migrant domestic workers was something that staff were already supporting, but it was also something that the wider staff could associate with. Many of our staff were in locations where they could see, where they hired and they worked with migrant workers, and it was somewhere where we were more likely to see results. So again, we came back to what do we do? And during these conversations, an issue that came up time and time again was data, or more relevant, a lack of data. And again, keeping that mindset of a long-term holistic project in mind, we agreed that gathering data was the first step. So working with migration experts, CIFA, we completed a regional research report. This was a really exciting opportunity to go out and do some research that hadn't been done before in this way. CIFA worked with 4 local organisations on the ground in Hong Kong, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in Singapore. And we identified these countries as both places where Macquarie has a presence, but also where there is a significant amount of transit and source traffic around migrant domestic workers. The research went out and the interviews went out and they spoke to potential, they spoke to existing, and they spoke to return migrant domestic workers. And the idea of the report was to measure the prevalence of exploitative practices so that we could get an understanding of these practices and the ones that were likely to lead to modern slavery and vulnerability amongst these modern migrant domestic workers. The report's available online, but before I go to it, I'm just going to point out some of the high-level findings for you. The first one there is 97% of people migrate for economic reasons. That's probably not really a surprise to many. I actually would be surprised it wasn't 100% in many ways. 71% of these people, however, experience problems during recruitment. And I think to me, this really highlighted a particular point in the journey where women are most vulnerable. And that was also flagged an opportunity for us to get involved. In addition, another statistic that really stood out to me was around the return rate. With 77% of these returned migrants wanting to go back overseas, despite possibly having negative experiences or having been away from their families for a long time, 77% still want to go back. And it was perhaps they didn't return with the financial situation they expected they would be. They weren't able to manage the money that they had earned. Their families weren't able to manage the money that was sent home. Or it could also have been that they'd been away so long they weren't able to fit back into their own societies. As I mentioned, the report is available online. The URL is modernslavery.cfar.org. There's a lot of data and a lot of information available on there, and I do encourage you to go and read it. As I highlighted, recruitment really was a key area of exploitation, but the report found that exploitation occurs throughout the entire journey for these women. And the visual on the right-hand side of the screen there really shows this. It talks about the common problems that are experienced by migrant domestic workers before and during recruitment and their training processes, the experiences they have while working abroad, and the exploitation even upon termination of their contract and their return home. And one of the findings that also really hit home for me was around the awareness piece, of which we've spent quite a bit of time on since, and the misconceptions that exist amongst the employers and the employees. And the misconception here that we've highlighted is between foreigners and migrants alike, that the women who are working overseas are saving and accumulating wealth. And in fact, the report found that by participating in this overseas migrant market, they're maintaining a subsistence income, and large numbers are going home at the same level or sometimes even worse off than when they left. So we're now in the second phase of the project. The report was released in early 2016 and included a number of recommendations which allowed us to focus our efforts as we look ahead. A big area is around internal and external and awareness and education. And I think that this webinar is an example of that in itself. We have run a number of ways that we've done the external piece at the bottom of that slide there. On our Macquarie.com public website, we have done two expertise articles interviewing in a bit more detail the founder of CFAR and the founder of one of the organisations we work with in the Philippines, the Pasine Forum, to talk more about some of the issues that are being affected and bringing that into the wider work that Macquarie is doing. There was also some significant media coverage following the report that came out, talking about some of the debt bondage issues that came up. And we've also got, with bearing in mind the corporate element, the business-oriented solutions. So both through organisations such as the Mekong Club and the Fair Employment Foundation, we've continued to raise awareness amongst our own networks to make some significant changes in awareness and knowledge. Coming back to my earlier comments around our strategic grant portfolio, we've also used the recommendations from the report to guide a number of strategic grants that are currently in place. We are currently funding 6 projects across the wider modern slavery portfolio here in Asia, and they look at different aspects, covering some of those issues I've highlighted already. For example, we're looking at an improved experience for migrant domestic workers. So working with the Fair Employment Foundation through the Fair Hire Pledge to raise awareness amongst employers of workers. I encourage you, if you haven't already, if your company hasn't, to please think about signing the Fair Hire Pledge. It's a non-binding agreement to raise awareness amongst your employees. And I'm happy to talk more about the journey that Macquarie went through in getting that approved and signed, and we're really pleased to be part of that today. We're also working with CFAR again down in Indonesia, supporting some of the most vulnerable population, which I will come to in a minute. We're working in the wider regulatory space, and actually all of the organisations that we work with have got that element to their projects, and it's looked at in different ways in the different advocacy and policy work that they're doing, allowing and encouraging change to take place across their various jurisdictions. And we're also working on projects that are around education and awareness in the communities themselves, so as to reduce vulnerability. When we started working on this project, there was lots of comments around, what is modern slavery? And it's a very big word. And to me, a lot of the time, it's just that education and knowledge and awareness allows people to be more aware, to ask questions, and to remove that vulnerability. We're also working on the rehabilitation and community reintegration of victims. So working with Hagar, working with child victims who are not migrant domestic workers, and that is kind of coming back to that holistic piece we're looking at. And we're also working with the Sign Forum on the education of some of the child domestic workers that they are working with in the Philippines. And in addition, we've got lots of things going on beyond strategic grants. We continue to have staff fundraising activities. We have information sessions around the issues. We've run capacity building projects with NGOs working in the space. For example, a group we worked with in Singapore who provides financial literacy to the migrant domestic workers so that they can leave in a better financial situation. Interestingly, this has also provided a new way to engage with clients and with partners. And that's really bringing a corporate and a business perspective to this program that probably wasn't anticipated in the same way. It's looking at some of the people attending today, obviously of big interest to lots of different organisations, and how we look at it from a business perspective as well as community. And I mentioned earlier the CFAR project, and I also mentioned earlier about collaboration. And I've got a great opportunity for anyone looking for something to do immediately. One of the most vulnerable groups that we identified in the research was first-time workers from Indonesia. And so we're now funding a project with CFAR to equip these women with relevant information and knowledge so that their migration experience is positive and worthwhile. It's working in 3 provinces of the top 10 sending provinces through communication campaigns and workshops, which I really like because it's also being delivered by returned migrant domestic workers. So they can use their first-hand experience to share with future workers, and it gives them empowered employment on their return. It's also working with local recruitment agents, so the people managing the migration journey itself. Remember the piece that 71% of people experienced exploitation. To educate these people on the effects of their seemingly insignificant actions might have. But CFAR are looking for additional funding, and this is listed on the AVPN deal share platform as well. So again, if people are looking for an opportunity in Indonesia to work on this space, I am very happy to talk further with you. And you can check out the deal share platform. So for us, what's next? I guess watch this space. And as we move into the next phase of the project, it's natural that we'll start to evolve and we'll reflect some of the successes and challenges that we've come across. So again, I thank you all for listening, and thank you in advance for your questions, and feel free to reach out at any other time as needed.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you very much, Roy. And it's time for the Q&A session, and feel free to type in your questions and raise a question to our speakers. And we've received the first question. I think this is addressed to Roy. So Roy, how can small garment producers further down the production line understand the responsibility of supply chain before them? So say the garment producer downstream, which means the sewing company, how can they understand the supply chain issues, say in the cotton growing and that weaving part?
Sure. I think there are a couple of elements to it. Number one, a lot of times what happens is smaller producers are not even considered in any kind of discourse when it comes to modern-day slavery. So I think it's important to bring them into the discourse. The second thing is that I would say it is important to relate to them what is the longer term profit, because a lot of times what happens is smaller producers are looking at immediate profit. So why are they hiring child labor? Because they think that they are going to pay a lesser price. What they are not realizing is that if they become, if they are banned from producing completely, then their losses would be a lot more. So I think it is important for them to be brought a scenario, which I've said even earlier, is that transparency is not just for tier 1 companies. Tier 2 and tier 3 companies that you are talking about are also the ones who need to be brought within the realm of transparency by retailers and by brands, because it is not just about where the last shipment of the clothing is happening. It is the entire supply chain. So mapping of the supply chain and creating a mechanism of transparency is very, very important.
Roy, thank you very much. This is Kaylin from AVPN. I think we're having some more technical issues, but I also have the question list here. And another question is, what is legislation helping to alleviate modern slavery? And are you able to share some of these policies?
Sure. Sure. So a couple of them that I can talk about. One, of course, is the UK Modern Slavery Act. It is in many ways fast-breaking because it is one of the first countries that came up with a Modern Slavery Act. There is the challenge, as if or no Modern Slavery Acts exist, which kind of directly link to the apparel, linked to the supply chain per se. But what I would always say is that, you know, and this is very true for most of the producing countries, most of the countries in the South, is that it is not just about the legislation, it is also about the next level, which is the implementation of the law. So to me, that is a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of ensuring that the existing kind of is translated into, and share with you the Modern Slavery Act of the UK, Modern Slavery.
Thank you, Roy.
Looks like they're not back.
Hi, I'm
To
here.
me, the big question. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, Chen.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of individuals, to me, I think there are a couple of things really. One, of course, to me, which is the most important and I'm the most passionate about, is the fact that as individuals, are we asking the right questions? When, and this is not just about apparel, it could be about the electronic goods that you're buying, it could be about the carpets that you're buying. The question is, do we ask who has made my clothes? Who has made the carpet that I'm buying? Who has made the telephone that I'm buying? I think that question is very important. And as consumers, we have tremendous power. So as individuals, we have the power of the market because we are the market. So at some level, unless we start asking these right questions, we are actually going to miss out on the opportunity of being able to influence market practices. So when we are talking about advocacy, the advocacy and the campaign building need not only focus on governments and on companies. It should also focus on individuals, where individuals should start asking questions and demand information. And unless you have information, you could individuals could say that we are not going to invest in the product. And if that change happens, I think we can achieve a lot. And at this point in time, unfortunately, that is not happening. People are merely asking about, in terms of the apparel industry, people are asking about the style, about the fit, about the feel, at
Individual action.
Susan, are you back online?
Yes, we sure are. Have you got us here?
Susan?
Yeah.
Yes, we have you now. And the question was, what is the top one thing you can recommend to individuals to help alleviate modern slavery?
We had a little bit of Roy's answer, but I think actually a lot of it's going to be overlapping in that I think it's the asking questions as a person. So, I think back to Roy's very first example there around the brand of clothing that you're wearing and asking questions. But one quite immediate action you can take is that when you leave today, tell people about this. Even the fact that you've maybe learnt one or two or many more, hopefully, things about the industry. Go back to your employer, ask what they're doing, look at their policies and procedures around their human rights, around the training that they give to you. What information do you want to know that you don't already have access to? So I think being empowered consumers and empowered employees is something that you can do individually. And a lot of the time as an individual, it can feel like you're just one person and what difference can you make? But I think it's really important to remember that you really can, and just asking questions and being aware.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, Roy, and thank Caleb for save the place. I apologize for our technical issues, but I think it is a really interesting session. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. We will post the webinar recording on our website by next week. Please look out for it. Also, the 6th annual AVPN conference will be held from June 4th to 7th in Singapore, and will bring together a diverse group of founders and resource providers from around the globe to take part in the largest gathering of social investors in Asia. Early bird registrations for the conference are now open. Have a very good day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.